as I said at the beginning, we're entering this new unit where we're going to be looking at a bunch of problems for ethics. Well, one of the problems that has revealed itself is that, at least according to Nietzsche, and this is probably something that you've seen in your own life, people are starting to lose faith in the fundamental stories and worldviews on which Western society is based. Namely, Christianity, but also this idea that there is an objective reality that we can understand and come to know. This is what the video was talking about with regards to true world theories. When Nietzsche said that the death of God is here or it is coming, he's not talking about the death of Jesus in the Bible. He's talking about humans in Western society fundamentally losing faith and trust in the stories and the worldviews that our societies have been based on. And so this is a very difficult problem, a very serious problem. Because insofar as for centuries our society has been built on the Christian worldview, Christian morality, all of these ideas that we think objectively reflect the way reality actually works, insofar as we're losing faith in all that stuff, well, not only does that threaten our ability to actually figure out what's right and what's wrong, but Nietzsche thought that it undermines this idea that there is an objective standard of right and wrong at all. In other words, for centuries we've kind of been telling ourselves these stories so that we could feel comforted and have meaning. But what people are discovering now is that that wasn't true. And this raises a serious issue. Okay? So, on account of a wide range of things, people bringing up supposed contradictions in the Bible, the rise of the natural sciences, even going so far back as the ancient Greeks, looking at the Euthyphro dilemma and the problem of evil, people have started losing faith in these worldviews and these ideas on which our societies are based. Let me just describe a little of these for you. The Euthyphro dilemma. This is one that's investigated in the works of Plato. In one of those dialogues, Socrates asked, "Is something good because the gods love it? Or do the gods love something because it is good in and of itself?" This raises an issue. This is similar to something we've looked at previously in this class, which is it puts us on two horns of a dilemma. If we say that something is good because the gods love it, well, that would seem to suggest that what is right and wrong is just a matter of whatever the gods are feeling that day. Or it's just based on God's arbitrary will. It would make morality kind of arbitrary, capricious. And we don't kind of have that idea, right? So that doesn't seem good. But then again, if we do think that there are good actions in and of themselves, there's an objective standard of right and wrong, and because that objective standard exists, like the gods recognize it and they love it and they promote it, or God in this instance, if you want to believe in a monotheistic religion, that suggests that there is something kind of on equal level that God is on, or the gods. And generally we don't think anything is higher than God or on the same level as God. So that raises a different issue. Or we can talk about the problem of evil. This is a very famous issue. An issue that people bring up in order to argue against the existence of God. They'll say, how could you believe in an all-perfect, all-knowing, all-good God when there's all this evil and suffering in the world? A good, perfect God would not allow that. So either the God you believe in is not a good guy, or he doesn't exist. This is an issue, right? And I mean, people have been debating this for a long time. The general theme is this. All of this stuff throughout the centuries has been stacking up, and it's led people to, again, lose faith in the idea that what our society is based on is true and sensical and rational. This is what Nietzsche describes as the death of God. This turn away from the fundamental stories and ideas and worldviews that our society is based on. He talks about it in Ecce Homo, as you saw, which means behold, human, the human, or the gay science, or his book Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is a literary philosophical work that describes kind of a crazy wild man coming into society, describing to people how society is going to radically change because there is this process that is occurring in which people are losing faith in the ability or in the idea that there is an objective fact of the matter about what's right and wrong, that there is an actual world that we can come to understand and know. So we can summarize the death of God as follows. I describe it here as it is the collapse of meaning, religion, and ethics in the West due to people losing faith in Christianity, in true world theories, the foundational worldviews and ethics on which our society is based. And I'm sure this is something that you've kind of experienced in your own life. When you talk to your friends that are the same age as you, do they have a meaning and purpose to their life? Do they feel happy and go lucky, like they want to go and do things out in the world? Or are they kind of sad and depressed, nihilistic? I think a lot of people are nihilistic nowadays. This is an effect of this thing that Nietzsche calls the death of God. He says, God is dead and we have killed him. And again, he's not talking about Jesus. He's saying, because of the rise of the natural sciences, and we figured out that we can use the scientific method and reason to discover what reality is, that has retroactively caused us to undermine our own faith in the worldviews and the stories that our society has been based on, namely Christianity and what we might call objective metaphysics. Thus, people have come to question whether or not biblical morality is good at all. And once you start asking yourself, well, whether or not God exists, that might lead you to, well, if there is no God, if there is no divine lawgiver, why should we believe that there's an objective standard of right and wrong? Where could such an objective standard come from, and what could it be based on? Is it just an invention of humans? Is it just an evolutionary adaptation? Well, this is a serious problem for ethics. What Nietzsche prophesied was that this lack of belief and trust in the worldviews, in the concepts, the morality that our society is based on, that would throw Western civilization into turmoil. It would cause them to become nihilistic, to lose meaning, to lose purpose in their lives. And, what is germane to what we're discussing in this class, it might cause people to think there is no objective standard of right and wrong either. It's all just a matter of interpretation. It's all relative, whatever. Right? And this was something that he was trying to actually warn people about. He was trying to get people to understand, look, this is coming. This is going to transform society. Whereas he saw it kind of as a wonderful thing because he thought that once humanity was liberated from these wrong ideas, these illusions, we could start actually being free and creative people and do all this awesome stuff. We're looking at the negative side of it. We're looking at how this impacts, well, people's ethical views. Thus, on account of this death of God, people have become nihilistic. They've lost faith in Christianity. They've lost faith in the idea that there is an actual world that we can actually discover and know. Right? This is what postmodernism is all about, which says something like it's all just a matter of interpretation. It's all a matter of the model that you bring to bear on the things that you're experiencing. There's no true, actual reality. It's just a subjective interpretation. And it's led people to believe that, well, morality is not objective in the first place. It's just relative. Right? It's just relative to the culture that you live in. We looked at this in the first unit, right? Or your personal views, your personal beliefs, right? There's no fact of the matter. And so, one issue for ethics is this. Insofar as people have and are losing faith in some of the basic ideas that we've built our civilization on, they're starting to lose faith in the idea that there is an objective standard of right and wrong too. Because if there isn't a God, there's no divine lawgiver, how could an objective standard of right and wrong exist? What would that even look like? Where would it come from? Right? And this is one of the things that we looked at in the first unit. If there is an objective standard of right and wrong, it certainly isn't something like a table. Right? We can see and feel a table. We can't see what is factually right or wrong, right? We can't taste it. We can't experiment on it. And so a question arises, well, what the hell is that thing? And does it actually exist? Is this just a figment of our imagination? This is the first threat to ethics that Blackburn discusses. And it's one that people are still wrestling with today. Debating about whether or not there is such an objective standard of right and wrong. Okay, so that's the first one he looks at. Let's look at the second one. This is one that, you might say is a consequence in part of the death of God, but it's a legitimate threat in its own right. And it's the second one that Blackburn discusses in this book. And that's the idea of moral relativism. Can anybody remind the class what that is? We looked at it in the first unit. What's moral relativism? James Rachels was trying to talk about it in his piece.
What is moral and immoral is based on where you are and what your culture says.
Yeah. It's relative to your society or your culture, right? People do things differently. Cultures do things differently. So that might cause us to think, well, there is no fact of the matter. It just depends on where you're at in history or the society that you live in. Yeah. We might define it as the view that there is no objective standard of right and wrong that's universal for all people, but that it's relative to, the person's personal desires and beliefs or the culture or the society in which they live. And we looked at some of the consequences of believing in this view, right? Which seemed to us a little unsatisfactory, but it still remains a threat to ethics today. Because again, if there is an objective standard of right and wrong, how could we know it? What is it like? Where did it come from? These are all very difficult questions to answer, right? And things that people constantly debate about. So sometimes when people are faced with those questions and they're like, I don't fucking know, maybe there isn't one. I'm going to throw my hands up in the air. That's basically the moral relativist position, right? If we don't have evidence, if we don't have good arguments for believing in an objective standard. We might just say it's all relative. One of the things, however, that Blackburn is trying to do in this book is he's not just surveying threats to ethics. He's actually trying to, show why maybe these aren't such big problems. Show how maybe we could rescue ethics from all of this. He responds to a lot of these threats that he brings up, trying to refute them in various ways. So some of the arguments that he brings up against moral relativism is some of the stuff that we've already looked at, right, in the first unit, particularly what James Rachels had to say about moral relativism. And that was, if this view is true, it implies some, problematic things, or things we might not be willing to accept. Here's a quote from Blackburn's book. Relativism, taken to its limit, becomes subjectivism. Not the view that each culture or society has its own truth, but that each individual has his or her own truth. And who is to say which is right? So, when at the beginning of the last section I offered some moral remarks about the Old and New Testaments, I can imagine someone shrugging, well, that's just your opinion, man. It is curious how popular this response is in moral discussions. For notice that it is a conversation stopper rather than a move in the intended conversation. It is not a reason for or against the proffered opinion, nor is it an invitation for the speaker's reasons, nor any kind of persuasion that it is better to think something else. Anyone sincere is, of course, voicing their own opinion. That's a tautology. What else could they be doing? And so, one thing that he mentions here is that when we have moral discussions, functionally, when people say things like this and they kind of bring to bear a morally relativist position in the discussion, it doesn't advance the conversation at all, so that's an issue. But we might reiterate some of the issues that we looked at for this position in the first unit. Can anybody remember what they are? If morality is just relative, what would that imply? Does anybody remember? Well, the easy one is, if it's right, then there's no objective standard of right and wrong. Right? It would imply there's no fact of the matter about what's right and wrong. But what else? If there's no fact of the matter about what's right and wrong, does it make sense for us to critique other cultures? Does it make sense for us to judge other people? On what basis would we be making that judgment? It would basically be this: murder is wrong, according to my subjective standard. Right? Stealing is wrong. You shouldn't steal, according to what I believe. Right? But then people are just talking past each other. Right? So that's another issue. One of the big ones that I investigated in some of my undergraduate classes, in my class on contemporary metaethics, was a very interesting one. This idea that if morality is relative, moral disagreements actually aren't occurring between people. Which seems really counterintuitive, right? Because, don't you argue about what's right and wrong with people? Don't you have friends that are like, abortion is right? And you're like, no, it's wrong. Or, I think stealing from Walmart is wrong. And your friend is like, well, no, they're a multinational corporation. Stealing from them is right. It's good, Stick it to the man. It would seem like we do have real moral disagreements, right? About what is right and wrong. But notice that if morality is relative, what that would imply is every moral sentence that you utter is just relative to your own standard, right? So, if you're having an argument about abortion, when you say abortion is immoral, if morality is relative, you're saying abortion is immoral according to my standard. And you're getting all fired up about that, right? And the person across from you is like, no, abortion is right according to my standard. There's no real disagreement there, right? It's right according to your standard. It's wrong according, right, to their standard. If everything is just relative to our own personal standard, then we're not disagreeing about anything, right? So that's a strange consequence of this view. If morality is relative, then that would mean no moral disagreements actually ever occur. Because we don't believe in an objective standard, right? There is no objective standard. It's all relative to what we personally believe. So that's a strange consequence. It would seem that moral disagreements occur all the time, right? Just talk to your uncle. Just talk to your roommate, right? Your girlfriend, your boyfriend. Y'all argue about what's right and wrong all the time. So maybe that might cause us to think, well, maybe people don't believe in moral relativism at all. We certainly seem to be arguing about what's right and wrong all the time. Or how about this one? Of course, this view would imply that there's no right answer when it comes to moral issues, moral questions. That doesn't seem to be the way that people live, though, right? We argue so strongly for our moral positions, so much so that people kill each other, right, over their moral positions. We don't think that what we're doing is just like arbitrary or useless, morally speaking. We have some moral convictions. So it would seem that the way that we think and act in our lives, we don't really believe in moral relativism. And finally, we could say this. This view would also imply that if morality is relative, we don't have any basis with which to judge other people's actions or other cultures' actions. Right? Think of the female genital mutilation practices in some other countries. Raise your hand if you think that's barbaric. That's bad. I think most people would, right? Well, on this view, no, that's not objectively bad. But that doesn't seem intuitive, right? We want to be able to critique other cultures. We want to be able to say that moral progress has occurred, right? The problem with moral relativism, or one of the problems, is that we wouldn't be able to rightfully judge anybody else or any other culture's practices, which doesn't seem to be intuitive, right? We're like, look, what they're doing is wrong, right? That culture over there is denying people's basic human rights. That's wrong. But this position would imply, no, what they're doing is not actually wrong. They have a different standard than you. So these are some of the problematic consequences that follow from this view, or implications, you might say. Let's look at one more threat to ethics, and then we'll have a discussion about these things and see what you all think. See how you all feel. In the first unit, we looked at a moral theory, an ethical theory, known as egoism. What was that view? This was the view that we said was kind of implied by Friedrich Nietzsche, right? The guy who was like, the strong conquer the weak, right? Can't be afraid to stomp on a few necks to get where you want in life. There's no objective standard, right? So what was kind of implied by his views? This ethical theory of egoism. What makes an action right or wrong on this view?
If
Right, if it serves you. Exactly. One of the senses we get from Nietzsche's philosophy is that you should ultimately do what serves you. We've been fed this false story that we need to be kind and empathetic to everybody. Everybody needs to be equal. Nietzsche's like, that's not how fucking nature works. Everything is just natural. We're just animals, right? So that's dumb. Do what serves you. This view is what we would call ethical egoism. The threat that Blackburn talks about is a little bit different. Whereas ethical egoism says you should live according to your own self-interest, the egoism that he tries to discuss in this book is what's known as psychological egoism. It is a hypothesis about what fundamentally motivates humans at the end of the day. So you might say it's like a biological or it's a psychological or an anthropological idea. Psychological egoism is a view that you're all familiar with, though you just haven't had the terminology. It's the view that ultimately humans are just self-interested. Everything that we do is ultimately in our own self-interest. So why are you sitting in this room? Well, somebody who believes in this view would say, you're sitting in this room because you think that it's serving you. Why do you help your grandma? Well, it serves you to help your grandma. It makes you feel nice, right? Why do you help out your little brother who needs help with his Lego set? Well, because it makes you feel good, right? To do something nice. So this view says, ultimately humans are just motivated to do what they do out of self-interest. At the bottom, if you keep digging and digging and digging, what you'll find is everybody's just doing what they're doing for their own sake. Because it makes them feel good, or it furthers their goals, or it gets them money, whatever it is, right? This is a view that you've heard before, right? Another way that you could characterize it is it says humans are fundamentally selfish. Right? You've heard this view before, right? Well, if that's true, bless you, that raises a problem for ethics. If humans are just ultimately self-interested, and everything that we do is ultimately for ourselves, is ethical action possible? Like we think about it? Is it possible for humans to be altruistic? To do things that aren't motivated by self-interest? Well, this view would kind of imply no. Like, everything has the seeds of self-interest in it. And so it raises a few problems for the issues that we've been looking at, the theories, how we should live our lives. If it's true that humans are just motivated to do what they do ultimately out of self-interest, that would mean that pure altruism is impossible. What's altruism? Could somebody explain it? What does it mean to be altruistic? What does it mean? Yeah, you're doing something for the other person. You're not doing it for yourself. Right? Well, if this view is true, there's no such thing as altruism. Because ultimately everything you're doing is for yourself. Right? You're kidding yourself if you think you're actually doing something for somebody else. Part of that is, well, you're doing it for you. Duh. You might not realize it. So, if psychological egoism is true, that may imply altruism is impossible. Humans can't do things that aren't motivated by their own self-interest. It would cast into doubt Kant's whole ethical theory. right? Because what does he say? Well, not only does he say we should privilege morality, being good, over happiness, but he also says, like, look, in order to be the best person you can be, you got to do the right thing just because you recognize it's the right thing to do, and for no other reason. Right? This is when he says in his works, like, the pure moral action is not based on any inclination. It's not based on any self-interest or personal motivations. Well, if this is true, Kant's obviously wrong, right? And his whole ethical theory becomes something that nobody can follow. Because everything that we do is at least partly self-interested. So nobody's ever going to be capable of doing 100% moral action on Kant's view. Nobody's going to be able to just do what's right just because we recognize it's the right thing to do. That's a fiction, right? So that's another problem it raises for ethics. Another one that we might consider is, if psychological egoism is true, and if this is something that people realize and they come to believe about themselves, it might be really hard for us to motivate people to do good things. Right? Because oftentimes doing good things involves making some sacrifices. It involves considering other people's welfare more than your own, or prioritizing their welfare more than your own. This is what utilitarianism was all about, right? When Mill said that we need to maximize happiness in the universe, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Well, if it's true that ultimately all of what we do is motivated by self-interest, it might be hard to motivate people to be good. Because they're ultimately not concerned with other people's welfare. At least not more than they're concerned with their own. Right? And it would seem like if we're going to be good people, in a lot of instances we would have to prioritize other people's welfare over our own. So if psychological egoism is true, that might throw a wrench in our ability to, get people to do good, to conceive of their happiness as integrated with everybody else's, especially in this kind of disconnected, atomized system right now that incentivizes kind of very selfish, psychopathic action. Right? We might also discuss two more issues. If psychological egoism is true, I say here, it may threaten to collapse the grounds of moral praise, and it might threaten to incentivize good action. Let's go over these one by one. Think about in your life when, why, how you would praise someone for doing something good. Right? Your parents might have praised you when you shared your jacket with little Johnny in kindergarten. Right? Or you might praise your little sister because she didn't hit the dog. She petted it gently this time. And you're like, yeah, that's good. Keep doing that. Well, one of the things that we might worry about, if people are just fundamentally self-interested, is, does it make sense to praise anybody for what they do? Think about it. If we're all just motivated to do what we do because we're looking out for number one, that might cause us to wonder, should we be praising anybody for what they're doing? Right? They're just caring for themselves. They're just doing what they want to do to further their own goals, right? Everybody's ultimately selfish. So maybe we have to throw the whole idea, the whole practice of praising others for their moral actions out the window, because it doesn't make sense. Right? Why would you praise someone for doing something that is just, they're ultimately just doing it for themselves? So, I say here, psychological egoism might threaten to collapse the grounds of moral praise. Or how about the second one? This was related to the first point we looked at in this section. If it's true that people are ultimately self-interested, that might make it hard for us to incentivize good action. It might make it hard for us to get people to be better. Why? Well, because there's a fundamental mechanism within them that makes them do what they do for themselves. Right? You're like battling against a biological instinct or a psychological instinct or something. And how are you going to fare against that? You know? If we're wired just to be self-interested, it might be hard for us to make the world a better place. It might be hard for us to get people to set their differences aside, to work together, because at bottom we're just these selfish things and we can't escape that. Now, you don't have to believe this is true. Right? You don't have to believe psychological egoism is true. What I'm just trying to show you is the kind of problems that follow from accepting these positions. The kind of threats they pose to our ideas of what's good, how we can motivate people to be good, what goodness is. So these are some of the fundamental threats to ethics that Blackburn considers. Let's just go over them again. 1, the death of God. It seems like Western society has been intimately constructed on the Christian worldview. You might disbelieve that, but do some research into it and you will see. The whole foundation of rights in this country is based on the idea that they are God-given, right? And insofar as they're God-given, they ought not to be transgressed. So if there is no God, well, shit, do rights go out the window then? Is there such a thing as human rights? Is it just a fiction? That's one problem. Another problem is that what we think of as good and bad in Western society is strongly based on Christian morality. Look at the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, kill, commit adultery, right? Cheat, covet, murder. We accept all of these things are bad, right? Well, where did we get those ideas from? Historically, the vehicle that we got those ideas from was from this religion, Christianity. So, our political theory is based in part on the existence of God. Our ideas of what's good and bad are based on Christian morality. Our worldview that Western society is based on is based in Christianity. This idea that there's an earthly realm and there's a spiritual realm. That there is material stuff and there is non-material stuff, like immortal souls. That we should construct human society for the cultivation of virtue and transcendent purpose and meaning. Right? All of these things are based, at least in the West, due to our Christian heritage and our Christian tradition. So if Christianity goes out the window, then the foundation for what we think is right and wrong, what we think exists, what our rights are based on, collapses. And insofar as this has been a process that has been occurring in the last few centuries, it poses a problem for us. If we think that an objective standard came from God, if we stop believing in God, What other basis do we have for thinking there's an objective right and wrong? And also, people generally have just started losing faith in our ability to ascertain what reality is actually like, due to advances in postmodernism and structuralism and all these other different philosophical fields. Egoism, psychological egoism, threatens to convince us that people are ultimately self-interested. If that's so, a lot of our ideas about what is right, what is good, and what is possible in human life will start to be questioned. And who could remember the second one? What was the second threat that we looked at? Use your brains. Yeah. Right, relativism, which we already looked at in the first unit, right? If it's true that we are starting to question this idea that there is a fact of the matter about what's right and wrong, we might think, oh, it's all just relative. Well, that leads us down some dangerous paths too. These are all threats to ethics as a whole. The death of God, relativism, and psychological egoism. And we're going to look at more on Thursday as well. These are not the only threats that Blackburn surveys in the book. So, for the last few minutes here, let's kind of talk about this stuff. One of the things that Nietzsche predicted was that as the death of God processed, people would start losing meaning and purpose in their lives. He actually predicted that there would be millions of deaths in the 20th century, which is crazy. That actually did come to pass. And he kind of predicted that along with this nihilism may come, well, the moral degradation of society. Insofar as we lose faith in these things that our worldviews and our ethics are based on, it might cause people to toss them aside, right? And kind of be dicks. So the first question I want to pose to you is, do you think that's true? Do you think that over the last few centuries people have become morally worse? What do you all think? I mean, obviously we weren't around, right? A few centuries ago, or even just a century ago. But from what you know of, let's say, European history, American history, what society used to be like in the past, were people more respectful, loving, compassionate, nice, godly? Has society morally degraded? What do you think? Yes?
I mean, just speaking generally, there's obviously been pros and cons and how we've evolved over our world. Old France, and they still did like public executions.
Right.
We wouldn't do that now, but I guess we did improve in some areas, but in other areas we probably degraded.
Okay, so maybe it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Maybe we've improved in some areas, we've gone down in other areas. This is probably what, the boomers in your life are going to say too, right? What do they say? They'll say something like, oh, back in my day we would play outside until it was dark. Can't do that anymore. Kids are getting kidnapped, and molested and stuff. Maybe that's an indication that things are getting worse. I don't know. Or how about this? Insofar as relativism is a threat, is it possible for us to live our lives around that? Is it possible for us to really believe and act this out? What do you think?
You're saying in the sense of moral relativism?
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of people in this world that it's just like, I don't really know what's going on with them, and I don't necessarily judge them for anything to do, or for that matter, even really know what they're doing at some point.
Well, think about it like this. People have moral positions, right? Do they treat their own positions as being relative or as being right?
Right.
That's the kicker, right? It seems like we all have moral beliefs and we all kind of presume we're right, right? That's why we get into arguments with people. We're like, you're fucking wrong, bro. Duh, right? So maybe it is possible. It doesn't seem like we're living like relativists now, though, even though we say that we are. Right? Even though a lot of people will say morality is relative, they are still going to be stuck in their positions and they're not going to move. Right?
What about thinking something can be right for yourself, but you can acknowledge that there may be a better solution for somebody else?
That would be the relativist position, right? Yeah. Yeah, the question that I'm trying to press on is when we have moral discussions, and when we come to believe certain things are right and wrong, how do we act? Do we act as if our standard is no better than any others? Or do we act as if our standard is the right one? That's something worth meditating on. Finally, think about this. Is psychological egoism true? Do you think that humans are just fundamentally motivated out of self-interest? This is worth reflecting on, right? Because as we saw, if it is true, it has a bunch of consequences for how we ought to think of what people are doing, whether or not it's praiseworthy, how to construct our society, etc. Maybe there's no way to figure out if it is true. Maybe we are not fundamentally motivated to act out of self-interest in all things that we do. Maybe this is just wrong. I don't know. You should think about that. In any case, these are some questions worth pondering, worth discussing as we move forward in the rest of this class, and especially this unit. Does anybody have any final questions, concerns? Okay.